Hungry Trilobyte Podcast would like to start by acknowledging these fine conventions. SoonerCon is Central Oklahoma's longest-running pop culture convention. The next event is scheduled for June 24th through 26, 2002 in Norman, Oklahoma. However, they need your help to put on the next event. Please visit SoonerCon.com to find out how you can help make SoonerCon 30 a reality. The Hellmouth Convention. The Hellmouth Convention is a celebration of all pop culture, but specifically things like Buffy, Angel, Firefly, and Dr. Horrible. It is held in Los Angeles, California, and the next event is scheduled for June 3rd through 5th, 2022. Proceeds benefit the Los Angeles LGBT Center as well as the Ron Glass Memorial Scholarship Fund. For more information, go to thehellmouth.org.
On tap today, we have Stephan Reese. How you doing, good sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing all right. Now, you are a name in retro video games for many reasons. You have a media resume. You are a podcast enthusiast and talent. But the reason I got a hold of you was that you have a Twitter account called The Art of Nintendo Power.
That's me.
And Nintendo Power, okay. For the younger people, you used to get a magazine in order to figure out what was new in the world of video games. And for the really younger people, there used to be these things called magazines.
Yeah, that's definitely a reason why the Art of Nintendo Power isn't just an imprint on Twitter, right? It's also an exhibit. I run a 501c3 nonprofit called the Interactive Art Collection, and it's essentially a traveling art museum focused on the video game industry and more particularly some of the lesser known corners of the game industry, like the Art of Nintendo Power, like Nintendo gameplay counselors, that kind of thing. And so definitely one of the big drivers that gets me out there is how things like print magazines, things like call centers didn't really make the cultural transition, right? So there are, I'll put on a gameplay counselor exhibit and I'll get kids coming up to me going, I don't understand why they didn't just Google it, or what is a call center, or and when I present the Art of Nintendo Power, which is I'm actually presenting production materials and original artwork from the magazine. There are a number of people who just don't understand how print magazines were made, right, prior to Photoshop, prior to the digital era. So that's it's a funny joke to say, haha, I don't understand why I didn't just Google it, but like there is also a cultural need to explain to folks how these different things were actually produced. Sure, yeah, it's like we joke that people don't understand how why people didn't just Google things, or that kind of thing, leverage the internet. And like there is legitimately a generation of people who just don't understand life prior to digital. And so that's one of the big drivers that kind of gets me out there is wanting to educate people on this piece of the game industry that is just people just don't. There's no cultural awareness anymore.
I don't know. You'll probably know before I can even look it up. But I remember looking through one of the earlier issues of Nintendo Power, and there was just this spot there where you could actually see the graph paper underneath whatever layout they had set up. Like I guess somebody had just not filled in that particular spot, and it went to press that way. And it was like, oh wow, somebody missed this. It's the kind of thing that you didn't really think of until it was right in front of you. And I wonder how many people missed that.
Sure, or like when Nintendo Power would show level layouts, right? They didn't have any like way to have the engine display these levels, so they would take screenshots with a traditional camera and literally stitch them together. So if you do look at maps for any of the Mario games, or like Mega Man's a big one because the levels are so big. Every screenshot somewhere in there, you'll see Mega Man. So like on these big long maps, every couple inches, you'll see Mega Man standing there because they couldn't remove him from the engine. And so that's how those maps were made. I have a Dragon Warrior map that is the overworld map for the original Dragon Warrior game, and the artist took something like 500 Polaroids and cut them up and plastered them together, and then took a photograph of that, and that's the Dragon Warrior map. And if you look at the published version, you can actually see the seams, like watercolor variations and stuff like that, where the flash or whatever didn't quite match up from image to image, and so it's very clearly stitched together.
And that dovetails nicely into why the art of Nintendo Power is such an interesting topic, because they did so many unique things with the cover art, with the layouts. They would bring in sculptures, and they would do collages and action figures and paintings, and you never knew what you were going to get from one month to the next.
Sure, yeah, I have. It took me actually an obnoxiously long time to hunt them down, but when they were covering one of the Sesame Street games, and they photographed keychains. And so I went and I had to hunt down these particular keychains of Big Bird and Grover and Cookie Monster, and yeah, I mean they used what was handy sometimes.
And there were always those times where you just had to ask why they would do things a certain way. And do you ever get into those conversations as to the people who made it actually can say, yeah, this is why we had to go that route?
Sure, and most of it, as you might imagine, most of it almost always comes down to either time or budget or both. So, for instance, the famous Castlevania 2 cover from issue number 2, where they have Dracula's head. Well, the Dracula's head was just a Halloween mask of Dracula, right? And the guy that was supposed to be Simon Belmont was clad in a Halloween store like rental costume. So sometimes it was just hey, we have very little budget and we have very little time to go to press, and that's how a lot of these earlier pieces were done.
And there were so many cases where, again, people would be doodling illustrations in some cases, and I imagine they didn't have a huge artistic staff compared to some other publications at the time.
They did, but but it was varied. So they had a small internal staff, and then they had. But then this is the earlier parts of the magazine. Eventually, like during the N64 era, they actually brought everything in house. But but in the early, I don't know, first 5 years, let's say, I'm making that up. But they had a small internal staff, and they had a small staff in Japan. So they had an American internal staff, a Japanese internal staff, and then they also had freelancers that would come in, because there was just so much art that needed to be generated so quickly that the headcount that they had wasn't enough. And then additionally to that, they had the front and back covers were done by an ad agency as well. So they outsourced that to a completely different set of artists. So that's why you very seldom to never, I'm trying to think, I hate saying never, but I'm trying to think of an example where a cover artist also did interior art. I think maybe towards the end of the magazine, or the end of the traditional art for the magazine, they did. But certainly in the early days, you wouldn't see a cover artist also doing interior art for the magazine, because they were contracted by completely different companies.
Like the art for the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game was just something that it was a Turtles design that you just never saw anywhere else. And at that time, the Turtles were everywhere. And you had the same turtle art all over the place. And that art was so distinctive.
Well, that art was actually from a Mirage artist. So that's Mike Dooney's art. And that was that was the cover for the reprint of issue 3. I want to say issue 3 or 4. But yeah, so that was an internal Mirage artist, and that was Mike Dooney that did the art for the original NES cover. And the big like weird thing about that was, or weird to the kids, was that that art, since it was from the Mirage comic, they were all wearing red masks, as they did in the original comic book. Because it was a black and white book, it didn't matter what their what color their masks were. So yeah, that piece was from Mirage.
Okay, that's interesting, because just the style of it was just always so radically different than anything you would have seen in the movie, the cartoon, and the comic books were I mean, I didn't read Turtles Comics till much later at that time.
Yeah, Mike did mostly covers for the Mirage run. Yeah.
Okay. So how did this project come about? Because the fact that you can tour these places and show this off and get a crowd is exciting to me.
Sure. So it started with originally I collected video games, like just the retail stuff, right? Then I was a big set collector. And after I'd amassed a collection of nearly 10,000 games, it occurred to me that what I was doing wasn't necessarily difficult. It was just expensive, right? There were most of these games, there's, a minimum print run was 10,000 for the NES, right? So there's, a handful of games. So for someone like me who really enjoys the hunt, I wasn't really getting that anymore out of my hobby. And so I started looking around. I was like, okay, well, video games are not difficult. What's in that same vein, but more difficult? And so then I started collecting retail displays like signs and point of sale displays, standees, that kind of thing. These fine gentlemen behind me here, stuff like that. And again, I got to the point where, okay, this is harder, but still there were tons of retail displays for most of these. There was lots of Targets and lots of KB Toys and lots of, so I was like, all right, this still, I've now that I've got what I want out of this, I have the fiber optic signs, I have the statues that I want, I have all that stuff. Again, I'm getting to the point where it's not that hard. It's just expensive. And so I said, okay, so what is genuinely difficult? And this kind of coincided to a point where I was actually flipping through Nintendo Power #1. And there was an ad. The first page of Nintendo Power #1 is an ad for the Power line, the gameplay counselor hotline, and they all have these jackets on, and they're not actually counselors, they're actors, but they're wearing gameplay counselor jackets. And I said to myself, I wonder if those exist. Like, I wonder if the jackets actually exist. And so, sure enough, they do. And my quest to find those jackets, and I don't know if you can see. No, you can't. But anyway, they're in the display case down there. But there were a number of gameplay counselor jackets, and in my quest reaching out to various gameplay counselors, I ran into a gentleman that didn't have any of his gameplay counselor stuff, but he's like, but you know what I do have? After I was a gameplay counselor, I went and I drew for Nintendo Power, and I still have some of that art. Would you be interested in that? And like at that moment, my brain exploded. Like it never occurred to me that was something that you could collect, that stuff would be out there to find. Like it never dawned on me that could possibly be the case. And so, yes, I was very interested. And that's what kind of sent me down this path of collecting art. It was really the intersection of something I absolutely love with something that's really, really difficult to find. Right. And so it scratched both of those itches. Like I was getting that nostalgic vibe. I think what's wonderful about the magazine is even pieces for games that I'm not nostalgic for, I'm still nostalgic for that art because I loved the book. Right. I loved Nintendo Power. So like for instance, the Darkwing Duck NES game, not the best. Right. It's okay. Not the best. I don't have a nostalgic love for that game. But I do have a nostalgic love for that cover. I have this visceral memory of pulling it out of the mailbox, that particular issue, and seeing the cover of Darkwing Duck. So while I don't have a tie to that game, I love that art, right? And so that's what really kind of got me on fire for this, is that it really scratched that nostalgic itch that I wanted just from collecting. But then also it was this paradigm of that plus something that's really, really difficult to collect. And that's sort of what sent me down this path.
When you're setting these things up, what kind of venues allow you to come in or are eager to have you come in?
Mostly retro video game conventions. That's the big one. Sometimes galleries, but generally a gallery is like a for-profit thing. So they want art that they can sell, and this art is not for sale. This art is willed to my own 501c3, and so it's not going anywhere. Like I am a black hole for this art, essentially, right? Like as far as like, I don't buy and sell this art. Occasionally, I'll find art for something else, like like a video game cover or something like that. Like as I'm looking for this art, I'll find an artist that like did Nintendo Power stuff, but then also did other stuff, right? And so generally, I'll just buy everything from them, right, as a kind of a lump sale, and then I can use those pieces that are not Nintendo Power related to trade for other stuff or to fund other stuff that is Nintendo Power related. So, but generally, by and large, I don't buy and sell art, and so that usually kind of crosses galleries off the list unless I'm like paying them for the space, right? If I'm like, okay, like I'm just renting your space, then I can do a gallery showing like that. But generally it's retro gaming conventions, and they are, it's the perfect clientele, right? Like it's definitely my people. And this is something that I don't charge for this at all. Part of that is just because I don't want to, but then part of it is also that I want to steer clear as possible from any potential, like, Nintendo is very litigious, let's just say it. And so I want to steer clear. And we've had a couple conversations, me and their legal department, enough to sort of like set some boundaries, right? But for by and large, I just don't want to mess with that at all. So and not charging money is a great way to do that, right? So that's actually why I started the 501c3. One of the big reasons is so that other people could help fund my exhibitions. All of the art is self-funded. I buy all of the art specifically. I do that for very particular reasons. But like donations would pay for preservation efforts, so like framing or like travel and hiring headcount if I needed help at a show, that kind of thing. That's what donations go towards. Yeah, so that's generally it's retro gaming conventions is my bread and butter. Although I'm sort of stuck right now because of COVID, but that's changing really soon. So, or it seems to be changing really soon. Fingers crossed. So yeah, because the last time I actually got out, I've done a couple like virtual conventions and talks like that. Like I did Long Island Retros, the virtual convention about this last year. But really, the last brick and mortar convention that I've displayed at, I did a Gameplay Counselor Museum exhibit at Portland Retro Gaming Expo 2019, and so it's been a little while, and I'm really eager to get out there again. So.
Not too long ago, you did a live stream of the Gameplay Counselor shelf and showed off things like a little Elmo statue, and
sure,
that was a good way of getting around the whole location situation.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's sort of what my Twitter account was sort of born out of that necessity, right? Like this, like, hey, I'm amassing all of this stuff and I have no way to show it to people. And so Twitter has really been an outlet for me to get the art and production materials and stuff like that out there.
I'm confused and surprised that so much of this is out there and not locked in a vault somewhere at Nintendo headquarters. The sheer amount that wasn't behind their doors is amazing to me. And how did that come about?
There's a very practical reason for that. The way that you contract artists, or at least the way that they did back then, the way that their contracts were negotiated, if you wanted the image rights for art, that was one price. If you wanted to keep the art physically, you had to pay extra. So Nintendo 9 times out of 10 just didn't pay the extra. Right. And so the art was then returned to the artist. Now, there's a million reasons why something could happen to it after that. Like, in some cases, the artist has passed away, or, they gave it to their kids and the kids didn't care and threw it away, or it just got, nobody knew, especially like in the early days of the magazine, nobody knew that like Nintendo or video games at large would be what they are today, or that anyone would care. And so a lot of times, like especially like the big clay models they did for some of the earlier pieces, like I have a number of them, but the particularly large ones, like the Maniac Mansion is a perfect example, right? That was like a 200-pound piece of polymer clay, a very large piece. And to a contract artist at the time in 1989 or whatever it was, it was just this thing that was taking up space in their workspace, right? They weren't thinking like, oh, I should save this, and in 35 years a guy's going to come along and offer me thousands of dollars for it. Like there was no thought process like that. It was just, I'm done with this thing. I've gotten paid for it. and it needs to get out of here, right? So like that particular piece, sadly, was destroyed very shortly after they shot the photos of it for the cover. But a lot of these artists, I think, were just kind of really meticulous about their portfolios, and like, it's not just like I'll find, like when I found Dan McGowan, his estate, like he was a commercial artist for 30 years, and so not only did he do, or for 30, 40 years, not only did he do these covers, but he has, in his storage, his estate still had like, paintings for herbal essences, tea boxes, and just it was just cataloged. They just cataloged it well. And some of it also came down to like being able to prove rights of ownership, right? So like if they, if they were contracted, like I was contracted to make this image for a mug, right? And that retailer puts it on the mug, but then puts it on a bunch of other stuff, right? Like in that litigious process where you're like, hey, that's not what what they hired me to do. Having the physical asset would be helpful. And so yeah, a lot of times that's how it was saved, just out of just kind of record keeping. But yeah, I mean, at the same time, a lot of it was destroyed. I came across one of the folks that was the layout artist for the magazine for a number of years, who would actually take the images and paste together the actual page, what the page actually looked like. So she had these like they're called paste ups, and it would be like an oversized version of the page that was like put together with glue sticks, right? She had thousands of these pages, and at one point she showed them to her kids and they didn't care, and she recycled them about 2 years before I found her. So like there is this, less so now, I think now, because like especially with things like the like $1.5 million Mario 64 sale and like all these like crazy numbers are coming up. People are getting more and more on board with like, oh my God, this is something that I should be keeping and save, and selling. But yeah, for the longest time, it was just a matter of the artist got paid for their thing, and when it was done, they just tossed it out, and that's sort of why I'll never know when I'm finished with this project, right? I would never know. First of all, Nintendo is not, I'm sure the amount of artwork that Nintendo is holding is not zero, right? Mm-hmm. It's something. I don't know how much it is. They aren't going to be forthcoming, let's be honest. And so I don't know what they have. They, less or more than zero. They have more than zero. And then, but at the same time, I would never know what pieces were thrown away versus me just not being able to find them, especially when it comes to, estates, after the artist had passed. Especially a lot of these Japanese artists for the Japanese team, they were using seasoned manga artists from Japan, and a lot of those folks were, in their 50s at the time, and so Japan has been a very particular challenge for me, because not just the language barrier and the geographic barrier, those both things are true, but also just the not being able to find these artists who also often the Japanese team used a lot of fake names. They would have their pen name that they would use for the magazine, and so like I don't know who half these people are because they used Spoon for their first name, which is true. There's an artist that uses Spoon for their first
I'm
name.
Not surprised.
Or Hige, which is like it's the onomatopoeia for a heartbeat. And so or one of them. And so yeah, there's some of these folks are just very, very difficult to find, or some of them are like so stratospherically famous now at this point that like they aren't really touchable, or that or their art isn't available. These folks who went on to become very famous manga artists, or like for instance the gentleman, I mean he's passed away now, but the gentleman who drew the Legend of Zelda comic in Nintendo Power Magazine was the same gentleman who created the Power Rangers franchise, or the Kamen Rider too, but like that whole genre, I forget what it's called. The Is it
Sentai?
Yeah, Sentai. Thank you. Super Sentai. He's the creator of Super Sentai. And he passed away actually shortly after the comic was published. But yeah, so a lot of these folks are like stratospherically famous in Japan, and so it makes it also very difficult to track down.
Now I'm wondering, toward the middle range of the comics, the magazine's lifespan, when you get into the Super Nintendo era, toward this N64 era, the big issue, the one that was like Christmas Part 2, was the January bonus issue that would actually come in a sack full of stuff with extra catalogs and goodies. Was there anything of significance on the back end of that from the production point of view that you found?
I mean, I have. That's the cover for one
That
of
was
those
one
issues.
of them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually my favorite cover. That's why it's in my office. But yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of stuff. Actually, that's volume 44, the Magical Quest issue. Just by happenstance, that actually is the issue that I have the most art for. I have like a lot of the art from that issue. But as far as like challenges though, like I don't think there was anything particularly challenging about those issues, only that there's so much content, right? That but a lot of it by then, actually, surprisingly, they were already going digital. There were
Really?
yeah, so but that would have been like some of the earliest versions of Photoshop were being used. But yeah, there were some artists that they were contracting that were working in digital as early as issue 44.
And that, now I'm thinking, it's starting to come together now that you're talking about it. That was about the time that the logo changed for the first time and took on kind of a almost pseudo 3D look there. Was that a coincidence? Did that
no, that
signify?
that would have still been a couple years later. That would have been around issue 69. It's somewhere in that range, in that N64 transition. But yeah, I mean, I think some of the Star Fox maps were also computer generated. So yeah, they were working with digital media pretty early on. I was actually surprised at how early they were working. In fact, in issue 44, the R-wing, they have the Star Fox papercraft. I don't know if you recall that. In the back, it's just it's like a cutout. You can put together one of the R-wings from Star Fox. That was digitally created.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
The digital stuff, honestly, is harder to find. So because these guys have like these ancient hard drives that just die, right? And so most of the time when I've talked to digital artists, that is 100% the case, or very very close to 100% the case, where they go, oh yeah, I did have some stuff on a hard drive, and it died, and that's the end of the story. So people like Frank Cifaldi get on my case for jovially. He's joking, but gets on my case for how disproportionately I display traditional artwork, and I kind of go back to him like, well, if you find me digital art, I'm happy to show it. But it's just finding those pieces that's very difficult because of the nature of old hard drives.
It's why I'm always a fan of redundant backups upon redundant backups on different forms of media, different physical locations. I have learned the hard way many years ago, and I just back up everything like crazy.
Yeah, almost the whole traditional archive. There are some pieces that are not. I'm working on getting a very large format scanner, but those are very expensive. And so because I won't put them in a drum scanner, because drum scanning is really how you would do like the very large formats, or like a feed scanner or something like that. But with original paintings, I can't risk that, right? So aside from some of the very large pieces, like the Castlevania 4 painting is very very large. It's actually an oil painting. I have everything digitally backed up and in multiple locations. But yeah, because I mean, this is, I'd like to say I'm the safest place, but like nothing's impervious to fire, right? Like nothing's impervious to those kinds of things. So like, God forbid my house burned down. The collection is very well insured, That's at least okay. But like, still, I would rather have my art than money.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, because I spend all my money on the art. So, but yeah. So, I don't even know where I was going with that.
Well, it's all right. It's just,
That's okay.
well, nothing. Yeah, Frank has actually been on the show too, and I would have to have the same conversation, with you that I'm having with him. Is that this stuff is more interesting than the people who have gone for full sets of games, because that's, like you said, that's not that hard to do.
Yeah, it's just
And
expensive.
yeah, it's the history that you find in going through those time capsules of old magazines, old records of what things were actually like at the time. Like, people take for granted now that they have 100 different sources for information on video games. Back then, you had the official magazine, you had maybe a third-party magazine, and the kids at the schoolyard. That was it.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about the people kept it. When the $1.5 million Mario 64 recently sold, people were in my inbox asking like, oh, like what percentage of your archive could you have bought for $1.5 million? And I was like, all of it, 5 times. Like
Mhm.
it's not, it's not. I put in the sweat equity for this art, right? It's not, do I get it for free? No. Like I said, I think I've probably spent somewhere in the neighborhood of like $380,000 on like almost 350 pieces of art, right? So that's not that bad, but when you get down to it, but at the same time, God, sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was it just talking about? Sorry, it's
You
been
were
a
just
very long
talking
day.
about how you put in the sweat equity to get the
Oh,
art.
right, yeah. So yeah, it's I don't typically buy from auction houses. I don't typically buy from collectors. Usually I'm hunting down the artist, at its source. And so, I certainly don't get this art for free, but I'm also not paying $1.5 million in an auction house. So it's there's a lot of gray area between there. So
Mhm.
to my critics who think that I'm like eBaying and like getting most of the stuff gifted, that is also not true. Um, but I'm not paying crazy amounts of dollars for it either. Oh, at least not what I think is crazy when comparing it to like an N64 game for over $1 million.
That's a whole other conversation. I'm convinced that those are not real prices in the grand scheme of things. They're there. It's a once or twice, and this year is going to be weird. And when this year stops being weird, those prices go away. But that's a different
Yeah.
conversation. But I'm amazed anybody could be critical of this, because, in my opinion, this is one of those things that is nothing but good for everybody involved.
Let's see some topics that I get critics of. A lot of it comes down to people. Like I said, I'm a black hole. Like, because of my 501c3, essentially the way that I structure, I've structured my will, that kind of thing. Like, once these pieces are in this collection, they don't leave. Like, and like, once they are actually property of the nonprofit, they can't leave. Essentially, they'd have to be given to another nonprofit. But so I get a lot of flack from other art collectors who basically want an opportunity for the art themselves at some point, right? So that's where I get a lot of that. I also get people who think that it should go to a brick and mortar museum now, right? People who are just like, oh no, you should just donate this all to the Strong, or donate this all to a game some other museum. And my pushback on that, and they're not wrong. It's not like it would be a bad home. Like, I'm not saying anything against brick and mortar museums. What I personally don't like about brick and mortar museums is that they only have so much physical space. So if I gave them this intense size of a collection, how much over the course of a year, how likely is any particular piece how likely is it that any particular piece will get shown, right? So like, it's going to spend, the collection is going to spend most of its time in the back room, in cold storage, right? Waiting to be displayed or waiting for an archivist to come want to look at it, right? So also, if you put the collection at a central location, then people who are interested and want to see the work have to go to it, right? Whereas the way that I've structured my organization, traveling to different shows, that kind of thing, people around the country, and maybe, I don't know, someday globally, if I figure out how to ship this stuff safely, people around the country will be able to see it at some point without having to go that far, right? That's the idea. And so, I don't know, someday will some or all of it end up in a brick and mortar museum? Probably, maybe, I'm not sure. But I'm certainly not ready to send it there now, because I feel like it's part of my mission to make sure that the maximum amount of people who want to see the work are able to see the work. So that is my beef. Not even beef. I have, there's plenty of people who are friends of mine who do work in the museum field. So, so it's not a criticism. It's just why I am not comfortable just being like, oh, I'm going to buy this thing and then walk it over to the museum immediately, right? Like I'm not done with it yet, right?
What the criticisms you're hearing, I would say, are, it's just ignorance, and I mean that in the least negative manner possible. It's just ignorance of knowing how the museum industry works, and I say that as somebody who plans his vacations around going to museums. I mean, that's what I love to do, but what they show is at best a tenth of what they have, and that's any museum you'll ever see in your entire life. They're in the exact same boat, so you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I'm not mad at them. Like I said,
No.
I mean, there's very logistical, sane reasons why they have to operate the way that they operate, right? But yeah, it's not time for this collection to be anywhere permanently yet.
So when you're talking to artists and reaching out for people who have, access to this art, you had said you had been talking to game counselors as well. How many of those have you run across in your day?
Almost 300.
All right.
But okay, to be fair, I spend all of my free time on this, right? Like, when I say that this is my life's work, it really is. Like, so it's not, I'm not saying that what I do is magic. It's not. It's just persistence. I spend all of my time doing this, and it's all, and so much about it is networking, right? Like, to get up to that like 300 number, for a while it was like finding one person, and then that person knew two people, and then it's the pyramid scheme, right? My network spidered out that way, right? And that's how I've located so many artists that were uncredited, right? Because the magazine very poorly credited artists, and, like, for instance, cover artists, aside from the first few issues, were not credited at all. It was credited by Griffiths Advertising, the advertising firm. So finding artists who are uncredited was 100% networking, right? I just had to, like, find someone who happened to know a person who also drew for the magazine, So yeah, all of it is and for all of the, like, counselors that are in the counselor corner, like, listed in the magazine, there were hundreds that weren't, right? Because at any given time, at the peak of the gameplay counselor department, they had over 300 counselors on the floor simultaneously. And of course, there was churn to that, and there was seasonality to that, right? So you're talking about, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of counselors over the years. So yeah. It's not just, finding someone in a magazine and hunting them down. Although some of it is that, right? Like, I've gotten very good at figuring out what somebody looks like 30 years later, right? But yeah, so that's how that outreach really works.
I always wondered, because, when I was a kid, I thought it must be this incredibly cool job. Then I ended up working in a call center, and I changed my mind on that topic. But I always wondered if they found people who had, like, especially great skills with kids, because of, I had that number on speed dial when I was little. So they must have been talking to so many kids each day.
Yeah, well, and that's why, like, I don't know if you've seen the counselor binders that I have, right? The physical binders that the counselors would pull their like maps from and that kind of thing. Most of those maps were hand drawn by the counselors, and a lot of them got good at map drawing because it was an excuse to not be on the phones. And
Nice.
Or, like, correspondence was a very popular department as well, that you could get cross trained in as a gameplay counselor. You could also be answering letters was a completely different skill set, completely different department. But you could get cross trained as a counselor, and so like people would try to get into correspondence because writing letters to children was better than talking to them all the time. Not to say that there isn't, like, a swath of counselors who loved it, right? And that they really did enjoy talking to kids, but yeah, and some of it wasn't, necessarily just like answering real quick questions. Sometimes it was answering a question on a game that, didn't have a save, so they had to work X amount of time, that like there was a very big dedicated chunk of time, like Legacy of the Wizard was one of the less popular games for counselors to answer questions on. Or, sometimes these kids, because like especially for the Seattle kids, because locally the number for the hotline, especially at first, was just a local call. So if you lived in the area, it was free. And so, or cheap. And so a lot of these kids, they, especially at the time, right? Like video games wasn't as popular with like parents and that kind of thing, or even like other peers. It wasn't unheard of to meet kids who didn't play video games, right? And so a lot of these kids would call in just wanting to talk to someone who spoke their language. So they didn't even necessarily have a question. They just wanted to talk to someone who understood what they were interested in. And you'll hear a lot of stories like that from counselors as well.
Wow.
But yeah, they certainly did take a lot of phone calls, though. That is true. Usually, so I have one of the Aspect telephones that they used in the call center, and when I show that to counselors, they almost always they say that they get like chills looking at the phone. Just 'cause.
I had made a discovery on my Aspect headset that there was a certain wire in the second jack that if I put the tip of my pen on there, I could no longer hear the person on the phone, but they could still hear me.
Funny.
Oh, yes, I learned to abuse that like crazy.
That's really funny.
Okay, but seriously, buddy, I really appreciate you talking to me here, and there are so many things going through my head right now.
Sure.
But I want to make sure that people have a chance to access all this. So where can people follow your exhibit and your postings and your social media?
Sure. So on Twitter, it's Art of NP. Honestly, if you just Google Art of Nintendo Power, Art of Nintendo Power is very good SEO, right? It's so if you follow me on Twitter at Art of NP, or just search for Art of Nintendo Power. On Instagram, it's Art of Nintendo Power with underscores between each word. On YouTube, it's also Art of Nintendo Power. I think that's all where I want to send you. That's generally will keep you up to date. I'm spinning up a Twitter account for the nonprofit. So basically, the Art of Nintendo Power brand. Obviously, I can't have a nonprofit with the word Nintendo in it. So the Interactive Art Collection, I do have a Twitter account for it, but it's just kind of a placeholder right now. There also will be an interactiveartcollection.org, but that is also all the nonprofit stuff has been like. I just got my tax ID like the other day. So the IRS only moves quickly if you owe them money. So it's been a very long process. So, but yeah, on YouTube and Twitter, especially if you want to like interact with me, if you want to ask me questions, Twitter is the place to do it, or Instagram as well. So that's.
I'm going to go ahead and put everything there in the show notes at aaronbossick.com. I would like to have you back and talk about a whole bunch more stuff because I am a huge Nintendo fanatic and you are talking my language.
Sure, man. I've also worked professionally in the game industry for 20 years, so I'm a wealth of information when it comes to the game industry.
I like wealths. I like wealths a lot.